Everybody's always like, we didn't make this shit. We didn't make this shit. Nobody's sitting at their house making this shit. Where did this shit even come from? You don't grow it. You're absolutely fucking right. You don't grow it. There was somebody in a lab intentionally creating these substances. The first one we're going to start with is opium. They was really trying to do their big one plan with the opium. You get the fun ones. You get morphine, heroin, codeine. And who's the plug? Bayer. Your neighborhood dope man is Bayer. Yeah, the aspirin people. Now that we've identified who the real drug dealers are, let's go ahead and put some names and faces to it, shall we? Although opium comes from the poppy seed, which comes from the plant, cocaine or heroin are not actually naturally occurring substances. Pharmacists manipulate these substances and isolate all type of shit. They do something real chemically and pharmaceutical with the shit, and then we get heroin. The first people to do this was someone named Frederick Turner and Charles Romley Adler Wright in 1874 at a hospital in London. I'm not getting into chemical compounds, recipes, or breakdowns or anything like that. Just know that they intentionally did that shit. So just to be clear, in 1806, Frederick Turner kind of invented isolated morphine. And in 1874, C.R. Adler Wright took his research and went ahead and gave us heroin. And so, like I said, in 1898, the good old neighborhood dope man Bayer picked it up, started marketing it as heroin. They were prescribing it for shit like asthma, bronchitis, TB. And initially, they had determined that heroin was an alternative to morphine because it wasn't as addictive. They were aware of the addictive properties of morphine since 1806. And I'm going to just throw in there real quick that 1806 is way before 1863. It wasn't us. So after Bayer got a hold of it, they were the ones who named it heroin and began to market it for things like asthma, bronchitis, a little bit of TB, good old tuberculosis. And believe it or not, heroin was touted as a wonder drug. It fixed everything, and it didn't even have the addictive qualities of morphine. That is until they continued and people were having worse withdrawals. They watched people fucking deteriorate after prescribing heroin to them as an alternative to morphine for addictive qualities. In 1916, they stopped dispensing it, and by 1920, they had put a medical prohibition on it. This pretty much ran them right into prohibition in 1920. Prohibition, they nixed the sale, distribution, manufacture of alcohol. I guess they were trying to be good people. After realizing the downfall that was heroin, they had another bright idea, and they decided that they were going to go from heroin to codeine. So I'm going to back up a little bit. So even though the actual white drugs, which is what they were referred to as white drugs, were created in Europe, that's not the origin of opium. Europeans were importing opium from China. Let's talk about the Opium Wars. So right around the early 1780s, China and the brand new U.S. started a relationship. They were fresh out of that toxic relationship with Britain, with all of those new bad habits to impose upon others. Now, keep in mind, just because America was no longer being governed by Britain does not mean that they had just cut all ties, that there was no interaction or communication. This is simply not true. The U.S. was trading furs and sandalwood and shit like that with China, but pretty much China was on some shit like, y'all don't really have nothing we want. Y'all have nothing we want. But Britain had noticed a need, whatever you want to call it, for smuggled opium. Britain got they bully on, fucked around and attacked China, and we have the first Opium Wars in 1839. So like I said, the first Opium War was from 1839 and it lasted until 1842. And it was between China and Britain. China lost to Britain. The United States decided to intervene, get their bully on. They bullied and finessed the fuck out of China and made them sign a treaty. Now, this is where things get kind of spicy. So during this time, there is something called the Most Favored Nation Clause. Now, under the Most Favored Nation Clause, all of the foreign powers operating in China could seek the same concessions that Britain did. That pretty much says that you got to give us whatever you gave Britain. And the U.S. capitalized off of that and made them sign a treaty. Now, from this war came two treaties. The first one was the Anglo-Chinese Treaty of Nanjing. This is the one that ended the Opium War in 1842. In 1844, the first formal treaty after the Opium War between U.S. and China was the Treaty of Wangxia. Now, I know I probably fucked it up, but this is how you spell it. Now, the Western powers started being extremely unfair, tremendously fucked up to China after that. And all the treaties began to be known as the unequal treaties because they was basically a bunch of bullshit. During this time, one of these treaties allowed for foreigners to own land and stuff in China. This had never been allowed before. So foreign nations and foreigners now could own land in China. But the Americans also had a special little accommodation. And that was that any Americans that would be prosecuted would be basically prosecuted under American law and not Chinese. So that was a big fuck you. Now, let's be clear. So, 1844 is before 1863. Still not us. Not us. So in 1844, the U.S. and the rest of the Western powers pretty much deboed China out they shit, told them to fuck theyself and be quiet about it. What's also going on at this time? There's a little kerfuffle in Mexico. It's 1846 and it's the Mexican-American War. They got mad at them folks about a little Mary Jane. They mad at China trying to depot their opium. And in 1848, James Polk passes the Drug Importation Act. In 1850, China was like, fuck this shit. And they was like, it's up. Around the same time, there began to be a lot of Chinese immigration. In 1857, though, Britain got bad and attacked China again. And we have the Second Opium Wars. Now, it's the Second Opium Wars. They don't really last that long, technically from 1857 to 1859. And that war was pretty much ended with the Treaty of Tianjin again. This is how you spell it. That was secured by Americans, and everybody else dogpiled China when they, kind of agreed to that too. Again, that most favorable nations clause. With that being said, China still didn't fold until 1860. And those treaties was still full of no Vaseline type fuckery. Following this, there was something called the Angel Treaty of 1880. And this treaty allowed the U.S. government to regulate immigration, for labor from China. The Angel Treaty reversed the 1868 Burlingame Act. And one of the things that the Burlingame Act did was encourage Chinese immigration to the U.S. for labor. So the Angel Treaty was followed by the Chinese Exclusion Acts of 1882. So they were still like, yeah, fuck the Chinese. And they passed the Scott Act, which pretty much made it impossible to get back into America after you went to China. They backdoored that with the Geary Act. 1902, 10 years after the Geary Act ended, they extended the prohibition to Hawaii and the Philippines. And they later extended the act indefinitely. They is Congress. All right, y'all. Come on, stay with me. So finally, if we back up a little bit, right after the Second Opium War was the Civil War. This is the bullshit that goes on in America. And right before the Civil War, they invented cocaine. During the Civil War, there's the Emancipation Proclamation, and we finally hit the scene. This period of time is known as the Reconstruction from 1865, when they finally let us in Texas free, to like 1877, when the Democrats, whose behavior mirrors the now Republicans, said, oh yeah, we promise, we'll play fair, we'll be nice to the African Americans. In a last-ditch effort to try to save the souls of the black people, they passed the Civil Rights Act of 1875. This essentially made black people human and respectable in the eyes of the law. Obviously, in a nutshell. It pretty much made public racial discrimination illegal. So I know I'm kind of all over the place, but the Civil Rights Act of 1875 is important because right after passing the Chinese Exclusion Acts of 1882, they turned around and repealed them in a civil rights case that ended up just being called the Civil Rights Act of 1883, which pretty much said, nah, fuck that shit about, black people being equal and racism being illegal. Yeah, no, JK, we didn't mean it. Also, the fun thing about the Civil Rights Act of 1875 was that it required all civil rights cases to be handled in federal court, not state court. But obviously, they didn't enforce that part. All right. We getting closer back to where we left off, around 1920. So, a brief recap on the backside, right? In about the late 1780s, and we're up to about the 1880s. The U.S. and China have had a relationship for about 100 years, and the whole of it has been fucking toxic. We've got the unequal treaties, which pretty much debugged their opium from them. So the Western powers, the Europeans, the Germans, the British, so they can do what they want to and create heroin, morphine, things of this nature. They just been taking their shit. China has said, fuck that. We tired of taking your shit. It's up. They got bucked. You know what I'm saying? They lost. You know what I'm saying? We got 2 opium wars. They lost both of them. And the most favorable nation clause allowed everybody to fuck them. Not only did the U.S. fuck them, but they used them and then banned them from coming to the country. So let's recap one more time. So I've shown you who sells them. I've shown you who invents them. And I've also shown you how it's kind of coincidental that the U.S., which has demonized them, went through multiple wars and did highly unethical things to obtain access and dominion over this project, to villainize it. They did fucked up shit to the people of the country. They started wars, all type of shit. They invested time, money, and legislation into their hate, to their propaganda. So, again, I said we ain't even hit the scene. We didn't. Until 1863, 1865. And by this time, all the drugs are outside. They had just got a hold of cocaine in 1860. In 1806, they had already been dibbing and dabbing with the morphine. They took the morphine and made heroin. This is they shit at this point. Mind you, we haven't even gotten to their little kerfuffle with Mexico. In 1886, John Pemberton has coke. Now that we've established who to blame, who to give credit to for these white drugs, let's get back to why it isn't who they think it is and why we know that they've always known that shit. Why it's cool when they do it. It's a problem when we do it. During the time of all this, hateful shit that they got going on with the Mexicans and the Chinese, John S. Pemberton invents Coca-Cola. The original Coca-Cola. The one with the Coke in it. Now, in an effort to be petty with the Chinese, the U.S. got all these brand new drug acts. They're blaming everything but the motherfucker that they're supposed to, and that's them. It's always a cry about some soldiers that they sent into a war that they had no business being a part of, being the victims of adulterated drugs. Now everybody got a cure to something. And like I said, we have 1886 John Pemberton with the Coke. So since 1886, Coca-Cola was full of Coke. Bayer is hustling heroin. They're also giving people morphine and codeine. All people, even the babies. Babies were dying because they were putting this shit in baby cough medicine. It wasn't until a ridiculous amount of babies died from false claims that they started to regulate the shit that people were claiming these medicines could do. In 1902, they passed the Biologics Control Act. Remember, in 1902, they also passed the Geary Act. Coincidentally, in 1903, Coke replaced the cocaine with caffeine. In 1905, China decides to boycott America. In 1906, they passed the Pure Food and Drug Act. In 1909, the feds started investigating Coke. And in 1911, they tried to outlaw it. Yeah, you definitely heard me right. There was a whole federal investigation against Coca-Cola. Just as a fun tidbit, I'd also like to throw in there that 7-Up had lithium in it. Pretty much Coke skated. There was the federal trial. And they got out of it by asserting that caffeine was not an additive. It was a naturally occurring ingredient. Therefore, pretty much what they were being tried under had nothing to do with that, and they were out of their jurisdiction. Coincidentally, they also cut the caffeine in half and ended up settling, paying court costs. Nobody got canceled. Nobody got jailed. Nobody got a felony that kept them from moving forward. Nobody's kids got taken or any of that. They spent the little bread and went on about their business. In 1912, there was an international opium convention. So the Hague Convention of 1912 was an international opium convention where the world powers pretty much came together and was like, that's enough of this junky behavior. Y'all need to get this shit together. The U.S., the last to be civilized, always, just like they were with slavery, took an additional 2 years to comply, and their effort at complying was the Harrison Narcotics Act of 1914. World War I starts in 1914. And then you have the Defense of Realm Act. World War I ends in 1918. And in 1920, you have the Dangerous Drugs Act. But remember, when we first talked about opium and heroin and all of that, they did not outlaw it until 1920 during Prohibition. So now that we're past the First World War and back up to Prohibition, let's do a recap.